Hello, welcome to the .NET Community Stand-Up. We've got Blazor today, and I'm talking now because I'm not going to be talking that much later. We've got two amazing people on. We've got Safia, and we have
everyone.
Pranav.
Hi.
Can you folks introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Safia. I host or co-host this stream pretty regularly on a monthly basis with John, and I am also a developer on the Blazor team here at Microsoft.
Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm a developer on the Blazor and ASP.NET Core team. I work on MVC when I'm not working on Blazor.
Awesome. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET Community team, and I am pretty much just in the front row watching today, and I'm very excited about that.
Yeah. So I think today's stream is going to be super fun. I'm personally very excited about it. Pranav and I are going to show you how to contribute to Blazor by showcasing our own developer workflows. I primarily develop in VS Code on Mac, and Pranav is primarily on Visual Studio and Windows. So we've kind of covered the full spectrum of different ways you can contribute to ASP.NET Core and specifically Blazor. So we'll be showing you how to do that. We'll also be talking a little bit about the Blazor codebase. So if you've ever wondered what are all these different files and folders that make up Blazor, we'll kind of be going through that and touching on those concepts. So it'll be a super fun stream, and you can always watch it later, save it, and refer to it if you've ever been interested in contributing. But before we do that, we always like to kick it off with the community links, which I am sharing here today. So I've got some interesting stuff that I will be highlighting with you folks. Let me get my doc out of the way. First things first is this article by Andrew Locke. You might have seen it floating around. So source generators are a new feature in the compiler. They essentially allow you to participate in the compilation process by adding sources and reacting to whatever assets are being compiled in a particular instance. And what Andrew has done here is he's written a blog post that showcases how you can use source generators to find all of the routable components in a Blazor app. And routable components are things like the counter page or the fetch data page. It's basically any component that has a route attached to it, like fetch, data, or counter. And what you can essentially do is what Andrew has done here. You can write a source generator that participates in the generation process, examines all of the components that are currently being compiled in your application, checks to see if they are routable components by examining the attribute that is on that component, and then adding it to a static property here called routes that you can then refer to during runtime. What's really great about this is something that maybe you would have done at runtime using reflection, or maybe you would have done something like written all of your routes to a text file that you then read and displayed on your web page. But source generators allow you to do that not during runtime, but actually during compilation, and be able to access that data when your application is running. So do check it out if you've ever been curious about like practical applications of source generators. We've definitely been doing a lot of interesting work with them here on the team that you will be hearing about in the Preview 2 release of .NET 6, which is coming out on Thursday. And we'll be talking a lot more about source generators in the future because it's a pretty interesting and powerful technology. So great way to dabble into it with this article.
It's interesting with this. I remember hearing the team say that they thought it would be more of a niche feature. Like they didn't think people in the community would actually be making use of it. And it's really been interesting to see how people are building all these things and generating source from all different kinds of things. And like you said, it's great that it's at compile time instead of runtime.
Yeah, which definitely gives you a ton of benefits. Cool. Next thing is not an article, it's actually a visual that I thought was really great. If you are on Twitter, you might have seen it floating around. Let me zoom into it here. So this is a community member named Conrad Koksa. I hope I got your last name correct. But they've essentially created this concept map of Blazor that covers everything from internals and tooling to kind of the different development aspects of Blazor, how we do security, the component model, also the different hosting models that are available for Blazor, server, WebAssembly, And now with some of the work that we've been doing as part of .NET 6, you have Blazor Desktop as well. And this visual just totally like resonated with me. I thought it was really cool and covered a lot of the different areas. And it really shows how expansive the ecosystem is. You know, it's not just like the components and the development side of things, but there's also the models, the deployments, the history as well, and then the ecosystem of like all of the different packages and tools that people build on top of Blazor. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be referring to this a lot if I ever do any presentations or things of the sort. Coolio. Okay, next link. So I think we might have talked about state management in Blazor maybe during the last community links, but I found another interesting article. This is a 4-part series on state management in Blazor using Fluxor, which is an open source package for state management in Blazor that kind of follows the Redux model. I really like this article because it's kind of very bite-sized and digestible, but also very in-depth. If you feel like some of the other content on state management isn't holding your hand well enough as you're learning about it, I would strongly recommend this one because it's very detailed and thorough. It's multi-part, and you're probably going to get a lot of value on it if you kind of want to build a strong foundation for understanding how Fluxor works so that you can then use it in your own applications. Cool stuff.
That state management stuff is always, it can get pretty complicated. It's really important, right? Because you're tracking long-running components and interactions between them. And so I get why they do it, but it does get really complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see this in-depth series here.
Yeah. Totally agree. Cool. Here, I'd like to share another kind of Blazor-related post. This one's from John Hilton. Talks a little bit about model binding and kind of essentially data management in Blazor. The scenario he goes through is building a UK-based traffic light in Blazor. And what I learned is that in the UK, apparently, they're like ready to go is both red and yellow, not just yellow as it is here in the States. That kind of blew my mind. It's pretty interesting. One of the interesting things that he covers in this blog post is this concept of primitive obsession. Let me scroll down to it. Here we go. So primitive obsession is essentially this notion that when we build out APIs, there's a tendency to gravitate towards primitive types like dates, Booleans, strings, when more like secondary types like date ranges would better convey what the API is doing. So the example that he showcases here is you have some API that takes a start date and an end date and generates some data using those two dates. When you use that API, you're kind of just passing these random date time values to it, and it can be a little bit confusing to understand what exactly is going on with these primitive types that are being passed around. Instead, you can do something like pass a date range value, which more meaningfully conveys the fact that the data that the function takes in is a range of dates, not just two random date times, and you're not entirely sure what those are doing internally. So I thought that was an interesting programming lesson to take out of this one that's applicable in a variety of situations, not just Blazor, but also if you're interested in getting a hand on a particularly around model binding in Blazor, this is a good blog post to get started with. Coolio. We've got one more link.
You know what? One thing on that, just while you're saying that, the primitive obsession, I've seen people talk more about this, especially where you've got, like, say, one method that takes in 4 different integers, and it's really easy to just get them in the wrong order and you don't see that it's an error until like at runtime. So it's really, this is neat, and it's also useful to see people combining some of the other modern language features like record types and source generators and things to do, you know, to take advantage of the compile time checking. So
yeah, one kind of new interesting feature that he takes advantage of is the assignment switch statements here, which I have been enjoying using recently, although I don't get a chance to use them as often as I would like to. But yeah, lots of like interesting new language features and stuff that you can take advantage of. Cool. Last but not least, it's everyone's favorite topic, authentication, because I hear that we're supposed to be securing our users. So that's a very important thing to do. So yeah, we've got a ton of content on this in the docs.microsoft for Blazor WebAssembly and authentication specifically. This article kind of extends upon that and showcases how to secure your Blazor application using cookies and identity web. What's really great about it, plenty of visuals to help you kind of understand what's going on. And there's digestible code segments that you can copy and paste with caution and kind of modify in your application. So this is a great way to get started if you've ever been wondering how you can kind of build alternative authentication schemes for your app that we don't necessarily document in the core docs, and lots of code snippets and descriptions for you to build off of there. So yeah, those were the community links. Thanks everyone for writing and blogging and creating interesting visuals and whatnot. If you have anything that you think would be interesting to show up on the community links, do let me know on Twitter or elsewhere on the internet, I guess. And yeah, that was community links for this month.
I feel like we need theme music or something.
We do. We should get theme music for community links. But I think now we're ready to dive into the most interesting part of the show, which is actually the meat of it. We're going to be doing some live demos, and I was joking with Pranav and John before that I really hope the live demo gods are in our favor today and that nothing goes wrong when we kind of talk about all of this stuff. So as mentioned, we're going to be showing you our own developer workflows for working in the ASP.NET Core repo in general, but the Blazor side of it in particular. I'll start off by talking about my development workflows in VS Code and kind of give you some tips and tricks on how I interact with the code base on there. Pranav is going to cover Visual Studio, and then we are kind of going to talk about the code base in general and help you kind of walk through it and understand what's going on. As we're doing all of these demos and conversations, feel free to ask any questions you have about contributing to Blazor or how the code is structured or anything like that, and we will be happy to address them. But with that, I think we're ready to go. I think I saw someone joke that this is when you QA your demo, and that's totally right. Cool. I think everyone can see my screen.
I would blow it up a little bit more still. Yeah, that's good. People watch, and let us know in the chat if this is okay for you. People watch on smaller devices, and so.
Cool. Okay. So as mentioned, I code primarily in VS Code when I'm working on the Blazor code base. What that basically means is I spend a lot of my time on the terminal and in VS Code. My shell here is actually called, my shell is Z shell, and the application that I'm using to emulate it is called Hyper, because that's very important to know about all of my preferences.
Hyper's pretty cool. It's an interesting, like you can write plugins for it, and it's a pretty cool system.
Yeah, cool. I'm definitely a fan of it, and it's got like a great theming capabilities. So what I've already done is I've already got a clone of the ASP.NET Core repo on my my computer here. If you've kind of been wondering how to do this, I would strongly recommend that you check out our contributing docs in the repo. They kind of cover how you clone and set up all of the dependencies that are needed for this. But essentially, the first thing that you want to do when you clone is you want to run this restore script that we have in the root of the repo. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to run restore.shell. And what that's going to do is that it's going to run a restore on all of the projects that are located in the repo. The repo is kind of structured like a mono repo. So we actually have a ton of different projects for things like SignalR, Blazor, MVC. And to start off, we want to restore all of these. What that's going to do is for JavaScript-based project, it's going to run a yarn or an npm install. And then for C# projects, it's going to run the restore step, which will resolve any NuGet packages, dependencies, and things like that.
Question on that. Do you use solution filters at all, the SLNF?
Yeah, great question. I think Pranav will touch on that a little bit more when he talks about Visual Studio, but we do. And one thing is that this restore script will will also install a local version of .NET that this particular repo depends on. And it's going to install that under the repos directory .NET. That's a mouthful to say. And then that's actually the .NET that we're going to want to have on the path whenever we're working with the repo.
I've got one more question for you. Everyone always asks whenever you're working on a Mac, is this an M1 machine?
Yes, it is.
Ooh.
Okay, this is actually a new machine I've received. It was supposed to be an Intel machine, but it's an M1. I originally wanted an Intel when I was asking for the upgrade, just because it's easier I wanted to avoid any issues around building for ARM. It actually hasn't been that bad. I've run into a few hiccups here and there, but .NET Core on ARM64 Mac is pretty solid.
Cool.
So yes, it is an M1 Apple Silicon. Cool. Okay, so once we've done the restore, as I was mentioning earlier, we have this local .NET that we want to have on the path. It's actually pretty easy to do that. You're going to want to do source, and then you're going to run this activate shell script that is also available on the root of the repo. And you can see what it's done here is it's activated a local .NET environment, which points to the .NET that has been installed in my current repository directory. Pretty neat. So that's usually all of the time that I spend in the terminal when I'm developing. And the next thing that I am able to do is dive in straight into VS Code. So one thing I recommend is do not try to open the entire repo in VS Code, because you're going to have a bad time. It's going to really be not fun. So generally what I'll do is I'll just open the components directory, and that's where the code for Blazor lives. And we've got code dot, which is kind of my abbreviation for running Visual Studio Code. Cool. All right. Once VS is open, I'm able to do all of my development work on here. One thing to note is that when you run the activate shell script in your terminal, what that's doing is adding .NET to the path, and that's what's going to be resolved by any extensions in Visual Studio Code. So if you have OmniSharp installed, or the C# extension installed, which I strongly recommend that you do, it's going to use that .NET that was registered on the path in order to do any builds or restores. However, if you're using the terminal within VS Code, that one does not use the activated environment. So you actually have to go in and source again.
So I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you with a really important question. People want to know what your VS Code theme is.
Yes, my aggressively bright theme is called Horizon.
Cool.
Cool. So what I've got open here is the Blazor codebase, and I have included intentionally a bug in the Blazor codebase in the navigation manager. We have a method in the navigation manager called toBaseRelativePath. You might have used it. Given a full URI, it returns to you just the relative path parts of it. But it doesn't do that now. Instead, it just returns foo. And I kind of want to show you what my development flow tends to be when I'm trying to work on things like this. So we have tests for the navigation manager because we are good little developers who value test coverage. And it's located here in navigation manager or test.cs. This is all of our unit tests for the navigation manager. We have tests that cover different kinds of scenarios. And so usually what I'll do is if I know, I try and do TDD. Sometimes it's hard to do, especially if you're like building out a new feature or what have you. But if I know that I'm fixing a bug or modifying something that has existing test coverage, I'll usually go straight to the test directory, which we have under components test. And then I'll just use .NET test with a filter to run the individual scenario that I care about. So if I copy this particular scenario, which is validating that toBaseRelativePath works, and then I could do that. And so sometimes I'll use .NET test oftentimes what I'll do, especially if I'm looking for a very quick read, evaluate, change, modify loop, is I'll actually do a .NET watch test, and I'll have my test case that I'm curious about running constantly in the background as I'm making modifications. And so if I ever make a code change in the navigation manager, it'll rebuild, and then my test will run on the command line, and I'll kind of have that going as a flow. One thing to note, make sure that you've activated .NET in your terminal to get all of this working properly. But now the test is running. It's so slow. I'm going to blame lots of different things, but typically it's a pretty fast process. And what we can see here is all of our test scenarios fail because it's returning foo instead of the actual thing that we care about. And so now I'll kind of show you how the flow works when we actually do it with a watch. And while that's running, I've kind of cheated, and I have the actual correct code here. This is what's currently implemented in the navigation manager prior to this bug that I've added. I'll wait for the watch to run just so I can show you how when I change it, it will rebuild. Cool. So let's do that. Don't let me down. Cool. So once I've modified the navigation manager, .NET Watch will detect the change, it'll rebuild, and it'll run my test case again. And it should pass this time around since I fixed the bug, quote unquote. On this topic, one thing that we sometimes will see people try and do is run the entire test suite for the whole repo on their local machine. Do not do that because your CPU will definitely hate you. Generally, what you want to do if you're making a code change is, at the very least, run any test scenarios that you know are related to that code change. So if you change the navigation manager, go ahead and run the navigation manager tests. Maybe run the component tests overall to be a little bit more confident. But definitely do lean on the CI that we have that's running in on GitHub to determine whether or not you've broken anything in a completely different test project or something like that. Like, definitely don't feel like you have to run the entire test suite on your local machine before you open a PR. Just run what you think is relevant and leverage CI when you need to. Cool. So that's kind of my loop for when I'm trying to experiment or do something really quickly. I rely pretty heavily on .NET Watch, especially when I'm running tests. Another thing that I wanted to show was debugging in Visual Studio Code. For this to work, you will need to have .NET Watch or the C# extension installed in order to be able to attach to a running process and debug it. And I will showcase how to do that now. So we're working on improving our Visual Studio Code integration for the repo by adding more launch configurations. But for now, I'll kind of show you what I end up doing to get the debugging working properly. So I'm going to cancel my watch session that's running here. Thank you for your help.
We've got a few quick questions if I can jump in.
Go ahead.
So one is just managing the .NET version that you're doing, and you showed using that you're actually installing with those shell scripts, you're actually installing a separate copy. So how do you manage two questions, I guess, is one, it sounds like the way, if you're going to contribute to Blazor, you really should be using those scripts and you should be building against the team okay, I see you both nodding. The other question is, how do you...
The other thing there is that the installation is local to the repository, so it's not polluting your global state. So don't worry about just because you have it installed, don't worry, your existing apps are going to be broken.
That was my next question.
Yep. So you can see it's installed. I've highlighted it here. I hope it's visible, but it's actually under my cloned repo in its own directory. So it's not going to break anything. And if you ever want, you can always do deactivate. And now it's removed from your path. And you can go back to using your globally installed .NET.
Okay. Another question is just what sort of changes or PRs or things, is there kind of like a help wanted section, or is there a recommended way for people to get involved? And I know you also do these sprints, and so that might also be something to,
Yeah, we have the sprints. If you go on our repo, we have some issues that are tagged help wanted or good first issue. Those are great ones to look at. Generally, if you're interested in helping and working out on something, the best thing to do is post a comment saying, hey, I'd like to push a fix for this or implement this feature. And we'll kind of work with you to design the change if it's big enough that it needs some design work, or we'll just kind of like give you a sense of what needs to be done to resolve it. But yeah, help wanted on the repo is where you know what changes need to be made.
Okay, and one more question for now. You're showing scripts that are working on Mac OS. Would you follow the same process when contributing on Linux?
Yes, correct. So the same stuff I'm doing here on Mac is going to work on Linux. I have done this process before on a Debian machine, so it'll work. The only thing that'll be different is different builds of .NET will end up being installed locally in your repo, but everything else will be pretty much the same. Cool. So when I do want to attach to a debugger in Visual Studio Code, particularly for unit tests, there's no test explorer in Visual Studio Code for C# tests or for XUnit tests. So what I usually end up doing is this. There's this like basic debugger attach statement that I copy into whatever project that I'm working on, and it's just a while loop. And let's say I want to debug into this toBase relative path method. In here, indentation from my pasting, and then I can run the test similar to what I did before. Let me stick a breakpoint here just so we can show that. And so what I will be using is the attach to process feature that's provided by the C# extension for debugging .NET processes. And usually what will happen is you can hit the little insect with the play button, run and debug. I know words for things. And if you've already installed the C# extension, it gives you an option to create a launch JSON file. If you haven't, or if you already have, you'll see this .NET Core attach option under run and debug. You can go ahead and do that. And you'll want to attach to the same process that is displayed here. So 61977. And if I do that, give it a little bit of time to do the thing. Okay, cool. Yeah, I hit the breakpoint that I set. And now you can do almost everything that you could do in Visual Studio. There's options for you to like inspect state. You can step through stuff and see what it's doing. All of that good stuff is available. So that ends up being how I want to debug in Visual Studio Code. Now, here's my last confession that I'll make before I hand it off to Pranav to talk a little bit about the flow in Visual Studio. If you are running in Mac and you're starting to kind of do a lot more development, it would help to get some sort of Windows virtual machine up and running. What I end up doing is I've got Parallels Desktop installed, and it allows me to run Windows stuff on my Mac. And I end up using this a lot if I'm trying to like examine bin logs or build logs, binary logs from MS Build. If I want to use like ILSpy to examine assemblies, all of those things, there's not really great tools available for it on Mac yet. So I end up leaning on my Windows virtual machine and experimenting on that.
I thought ILSpy worked cross-platform.
Does it?
I thought it did.
I might have to try. The other thing is I'm having a very fun time now that I've transitioned to Apple Silicon, finding out what works and what doesn't. Most things do because of
good point.
Emulation they have, but there's definitely a few edge cases.
Got it.
Yeah. Do you have any questions about?
Sorry, there's some stuff going on in the chat. Let me see. There was one. Okay, let me see. So Eagle, who works on B-Unit, he said, have you gotten Visual Studio Live unit testing working with projects involving Razor files?
I don't think so. I don't use Visual Studio. Pranav, do you?
I don't use live unit testing. I think just because like the sheer volume of tests, I've turned it off. Like my experience hasn't been super great.
Yeah.
I think Kendra responded to Eagle.
Oh, right. Okay. Cool.
All right, Pranav, you want to take it away and show folks how you do things in Visual Studio?
Yep. Screen number 2. All right. Let me know if you can see my screen. All right.
Yes.
So the same way Safia started off on the CLI, like before we get into VS, we have to like do some prep steps before we can you can open up an ASP.NET Core solution inside of Visual Studio. The same things that Safia did. So we basically acquire and activate a .NET SDK that the repository requires at a point. Basically, the repo picks up a new build of the SDK ever so often, and like we require it to build the repository, so it's on the bleeding edge of the of a preview SDK. So you start out by getting that. Sorry, I got a new keyboard because my other one was like super noisy. But I already had the SDK installed, so I'm like skipping the restore step just to like in the interest of time. But you would run restore, you would activate it, and then basically now what happens is that like you get the .NET SDK locally installed, it restores all the NuGet packages, and then it sets it up so that like when you launch VS or VS Code, this version of the .NET SDK starts being used to build and run things. So
hey, Pranav, can you zoom in a bit for us old people?
Yes.
Actually zoom in a lot.
Oh boy.
Still more,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So our team extensively uses solution filters. So solution filters are a new thing in 69. So that's VS 2019. There's a doc article about it. Basically, what it lets you do is if you have a solution with like hundreds of projects like the ASP.NET Core repository, you can create like sort of views into the solution and then save them to this. So the next time, like you can choose to say only load these subsets of things, and like it massively speeds up. Yeah. So if the ASP.NET Core repo, I think has about 250 projects and all, but like Blazor has about maybe about 24, including tests and all of those things. So there's a big difference having VS churn over like 24 projects versus 200 projects. Plus, like you're not actively working on any of those other things, so why load them?
I just have to throw out too, we just added those in VS Mac also, solution filter support.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So the Blazor folder has like 2 solution filters, one called Components SNLF and another one called NodeApps. So the NodeApps is like a much smaller view of it. It doesn't include any of the other dependencies that Blazor depends on. For example, like Blazor server depends on uses SignalR. If you looked at like the image that Safia shared with us earlier, it depends on SignalR. It has like it uses MVC for some things, like for pre-rendering and things like that. So this solution here would include all of those things. That's why it's bigger. The other one, it basically has Blazor. It's fairly much focused at it. We'll start with the second one just in the because it and because I've activated, like if I launch and there's a file association between VS and like the solution filter, it'll launch with the right .NET and so on. So we'll give it a sec. I usually don't use the light theme, but I think it works better on screens. So Hey.
Also with this, you'll need to zoom in a bunch more.
I'm sorry.
Not quite that much. One more up.
One more up.
Yep.
Oh boy.
I know.
All right.
Well, yeah, maybe there. Yep. Sorry.
I think I can set it to 200. Yeah, like, how about
That's
this?
good. That's
Yep.
good.
Okay. So if you open the solution filter, you basically get a view of like only the Blazor portions of things. So there's components, there's the WebAssembly portion of things. So this displays WebAssembly. There's also the all new for 6.0 Blazor desktop stuff, the web view things. So we're still working on it. Watch out for announcements about this. So I haven't used the live testing, but Test Explorer works really well with Blazor. So if you notice, I introduced a bug in my code. So maybe somebody reported a bug, or we've noticed a test failure. Blazor uses a mix of unit tests, like regular XUnit tests that simply do assertions on like C# code, but a lot of its tests are also driven through the end-to-end. So basically through browser automation. So we use Selenium, we launch a browser, and I mean like do browser automation, click around things and so on and so forth to find things. So in this case, like I've noticed that there's a bug in my forms test, ignored the other one. So the unfortunate part is like this produces like way too much text. This is because it's basically emitting like a dump of like the browser. There are more recently we've been working on adding ways to get like video recordings and things like that. So you can see where things failed. But at the very end of it, like you would see like a very familiar like, hey, assertion failed. So let's go look at what this looks like. So this said, oh, we expected a CSS class to be there with said valid, like that didn't turn up. So something about either a validation or like the input component itself is wrong. So maybe we can like debug through this and see how that goes. Also, like ignore the squiggly lines. We're working on like a new SDK. So it's caused some quirkiness with VS. It makes it like seem like these things don't exist, but they actually exist and it builds fine.
It's amusing that that bug showed up on the demo.
Yep. It's built in.
Yeah. So I wanted to, Pranav was mentioning earlier, we're working on migrating our end-to-end test infrastructure from Selenium to a new tool called Playwright, which should hopefully be much awesomer. So stay tuned for that.
Oh boy, I forgot to remove my breakpoints. Hey, all right. So in this case, I'm going to cheat a bit because I'm going to be like, I know there's two things that could have gone wrong. So I'm going to go open up this one here, and then like F5. This should eventually break. Nope. Did it just fail? Oh, I don't know if I broke my test entirely. Hey, demo fail. Isn't that fun?
Well, while you're doing that, there's a question on which version of Visual Studio to use. Does it matter? Like, so in the questions, I guess there's preview and the release, but then there's also the community or enterprise or whatever. Does it make a difference?
So yeah, okay, I guess like something went wrong, but I'll get to that. But like, okay, so this one was like simple. We knew like the bug was basically like we had a typo in our code. We'll fix it. We can rerun the test, and it should work fine. So the repository comes with at the root of the repository, we basically require a couple of additional workloads to build and run things. We actually give you a script that installs all the like a version of VS which has all the right workloads for you. So if you go up here, and this is part of our getting started talks. Sorry, install this one. You can basically specify what SKU of VS you want. So you can say like enterprise versus, I have no idea what these things are, the edition, but you can say like professional versus community versus enterprise. It really doesn't matter if you prefer, like if you don't have access to a professional or enterprise SKU, you can use a community SKU to build this repo. I use the professional SKU just because it comes with a couple of debugging tools that aren't available in the community one, but like for your day-to-day developing, you don't need anything beyond that. I use the publicly released preview builds of VS. So I'm on 16.10 preview 1, but typically the most recently released RTM version of VS should work for you. But if you use the script, like it'll install the right things for you. Okay, so anyway, we fixed that typo. I have no idea why it didn't break into this. It usually does, but we reran the test and hey, it passed. So that's typically your workflow around with VS. Like unlike Safia, you didn't have to put a lot of janky code, although it also didn't break into it. So one. So. And cool. I guess that's all I had to share.
Yeah. So I think one, obviously Pranav and I are have been doing this for a while, but I think one thing that's kind of key to highlight in both of these is our workflows tend to kind of focus on like a edit, validate, re-edit loop within a single thing. So that's kind of generally what I tend to recommend for people is the repo is very large. But you kind of really just have to focus on finding the one part of the code that you care about, whether it's that one unit test or that one source file, and then kind of build your dev loop around that one in particular. Which I think brings us to the next part of our talk, where we kind of go through the code base for Blazor a little bit. Do we have any questions we want to take a look at before we do that?
Eagle has a question about Selenium and Playwright.
Yes. Okay. So can you share reasons for going away from Selenium? I get a lot of questions from folks on a good way to do end-to-end testing and would love to know. So I think we had a couple of reasons for doing it. One of the first is that Playwright has a little bit of better primitives for kind of like doing, I guess, if I was a JavaScript person, I'd call it promise-based testing. But it just has better support for async await in tests. It also has better support for different browser types, so like Firefox, WebKit, Safari, across different platforms, which we weren't getting with Selenium. And it also produces more richer, that's poor grammar, richer artifacts when you're trying to debug. So you can get things like videos of your test scenario running. You can get network logs out of your tests. So lots of like better outcomes if you're trying to figure out what's broken with a test and debug it. To
add to like Safia's thing, like the second bullet point was like with Selenium, the acquisition story is a little complicated because you involve Node, and you involve Java just to be able to like install the driver and things like that. Playwright is entirely managed, so there's fewer things. It is C# based, so there's Playwright.net, which I guess is the C# based version of it. So it's completely managed. The acquisition story is also like it's managed to restore, so it's not we don't need to like we would no longer require Java or npm to like bootstrap these things. So it's a little more things that we are familiar with, so like we can make it better.
Yeah, we're still rolling out in the repo. So far we've rolled it out to our template tests, and we're going to be rolling out to our end-to-end tests, but I think so far so good. It's a pretty enjoyable tool. All right, I will share my screen and we'll kind of wrap things up by talking a little bit about the actual code base and where things live. You'll notice that when Pranav and I were doing our demos, we were able to like very quickly figure out what things to open and where to go to find things. That's kind of by virtue of the fact that we've been working in this repo for a long time. It can be overwhelming if you're not experienced to like know even like what folder to open or where things live. So we figured we'd close it off by talking a little bit about the structure that we use for organizing code in Blazor. And we'll kind of just cover it now. So everything that you care about with regards to Blazor is going to generally live in the components repo or the components directory within the repo. Pranav mentioned earlier, we do take some dependencies on SignalR and some things in MVC, but it's very rare that you'll need to dabble into those. So this is your home if you care about Blazor. It's all of this lovely component stuff. And so one of the things that we've kind of been touching on is the fact that Blazor has these different hosting models. So you've got Blazor WebAssembly, you've got Blazor Server, you've got now the desktop stuff, Blazor Desktop. And all of this is located within the components directory. So all of the WebAssembly stuff is under the WebAssembly directory. So this is where you'll find things like the WebAssembly application or the WebAssembly dev server. Any WebAssembly specific authentication stuff lives here. So we have the WebAssembly authentication library. We have the MSOL based authentication library as well, which is Blazor WebAssembly specific. So anything where you're thinking this only really applies to WebAssembly and not server or desktop, it's going to be in your WebAssembly directory. One thing you'll also note is that we have some Blazor WebAssembly specific test assets. So this is things like a basic Blazor WebAssembly standalone app. So not a hosted app, just a plain old Blazor app. We've got hosted apps, and these are really helpful to use if you're trying to do some testing or validation within the repo. I didn't showcase this during my demo, but another kind of thing I'll lean on sometimes is I'll run an actual test app and kind of debug things interactively when I'm trying to figure out what's broken. So that's WebAssembly. Pranav, did you have anything you wanted to add about our favorite? Yeah.
No.
Cool.
Actually, one question that came up. So Ego was asking their source.net, which he had to escape here, and he said that he hasn't seen the ASP.NET Core files indexed on there lately.
Yeah, great question. So I believe it's been resolved, but there have actually been some issues getting that source indexing working. I know since last week, there's some kinks that needed to be resolved within the bug. As far as I know, as of maybe 4 hours ago, that was fixed. If that's still not the case, they might still be working through some of those bugs. But yes, there's kind of some, I guess, downtime there at the moment. Cool. We covered kind of WebAssembly. We also have a server directory for any server specific stuff. The server directory is structured a little bit differently. One thing you'll notice is that we have a test directory and a source directory. That kind of tends to be the model for all of the projects in general. Source, as you might suspect, contains actual source files, like you have your project file, C# files, and your tests are all of the unit tests that need to be run that are related in particular to Blazor Server. One thing I wanted to cover that we kind of don't talk, or you might be unfamiliar with as a contributor, is these public API shipped and unshipped text files. So this is something new that we introduced, I think, right around when we were working on .NET 5. And it's basically how we track what APIs have already been shipped as part of a major release like .NET 6 or .NET 5 and which ones haven't. So when you're developing on the repo, if you do something that modifies a public API and you do a build, a Roslyn analyzer might kick in and complain at you saying, hey, you changed an API, but you haven't made the necessary updates to the text file. And Pranav, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe if you're in VS, there is a code fix in VS that will automatically.
Yep, there is a code fix. Like if you double click on the error message in the error bar, it'll take you there. You can control dot, which I guess, or if you have another gesture to light up the Roslyn help window, it'll come up and you can say add this to the shipped API. If you, I guess these days it's impossible to get one of these changes built without knowing it locally.
Yeah. So if you try and build locally, you'll get an error about this. And if you do it in CI, you'll also get an error. These are particularly helpful when we do API reviews, because it kind of will get a text diff of how the API changed and kind of use that to figure out what needs to be worked on. Cool. Other interesting thing, I think, is Blazor is not entirely C# based. There are some aspects of the framework that are implemented in TypeScript, and they live in this Webjs directory. So this is a JavaScript-based project. Similar to the rest of the structure, it contains the source directory and the test directory. It's all in TypeScript. We have things like, we have some WebAssembly and some server-specific code in here. Unlike the other parts of the components directory, it's not split up by hosting model type. So server stuff's in here, WebView stuff's in here, WebAssembly stuff is in here. Also, the client or the JavaScript-based parts of the rendering model and the platform are also implemented here. So this is where you might want to tend to go make changes if you are kind of, I don't know, building out a new API. Yeah.
Dabbling with like changing to the rendering algorithm, like effectively.
Or maybe, you know, doing something that involves adding or working with JS interop that might also happen here. But yes. Pranav, you're going to have to remind me, are we still committing the release files to code?
Yeah, I guess we added a new one too. So the way Blazor server works is that it embeds the JS file as part of itself. And we have certain requirements around building from source, which makes it difficult for us to include like the JavaScript toolchain in those environments. So our workaround so far has been to simply commit the outputs to source, and then we source include them. Like, you know, we embed them into the assembly. So, and now we have another one because I guess Blazor Desktop has the same problem.
Yeah. How this affects you when you're developing is if you do end up modifying the TypeScript assets and you do a build, it'll generate a new JavaScript compiled file, the transpiled JavaScript. You'll have to commit that as well. This is kind of non-traditional. Most JavaScript-based projects don't commit built sources into the repo, but we do because of the kind of packaging complexities that Pranav was talking about earlier. Cool. Now, outside of the web hosting or the hosting model specific stuff and then the JavaScript things, elsewhere in the directory, we have stuff that is common across all hosting models. So we have things like components, which covers things like rendering, routing, how parameters work in Blazor in general, and this affects all things Blazor. And we've got things related to forms, authorization, which is if you're dabbling in any authentication related things, you'll want to work on. We have some shared resources. I'm actually not sure what's in here. I'll have to jog my mind.
Just source files.
Just helpful stuff and things. Shared utilities or common class functions that are used elsewhere in the repo. I think that's it. I'd like to see if we have any questions from folks who are watching, or you, John, as we're kind of walking through this.
So one thing from me, I know you talked about testing. Did you talk about like performance testing? Do we do testing to make sure you're not having a regression on performance?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about it, and Pranav, I don't know if you want to add color to it. So for performance testing, we kind of have a repo-wide infrastructure that we use to measure performance on different things. It uses a benchmarking tool called Crank, and we're actually able to run performance tests on different machines at regular intervals, and we'll get automated issues will be created automatically on the repo if there's a regression that's detected. And I think we also have some benchmarking apps that we've committed to the repo that we've used in the past for things. Pranav, do you want to add any color to that?
Yeah. So some of our projects, I think like the component one, they do use benchmark.net to like do micro benchmarking. These tend to be useful, like, if you're doing really small, like, hey, change the order of assigning these things, or don't use a read-only struct because like that causes like more allocations or things like that. But the benchmark apps were like further up, like they do more of the end-to-end sort of things. We run them using Crank, and then like Safia said, we get reports of it. We still continue using them, and like so that's what when we like in 5.0 when we reported, hey, Blazor is faster compared to 3.2, like that's where those numbers came from.
Okay. I saw that you had sent me the link to Playwright Sharp, so I'm sharing that in the chat. There's a question on version of C#. Is it, are we using C# 8 or 9? Does that?
So we use the version of C# that the SDK determines. So it's like, I think they in 5.0 they changed it, or maybe it was 3.1. They changed it so that if you target the latest TFM, you always get the latest language version. So I think it's C# 10-ish because it's not official, but like it's the preview version of C# 10.
Oh, cool. And it is nice how things are all like segmented off. And like you said, you're using your own like separate copy of .NET. So you can use all these features without kind of worrying about affecting other things. So.
Right.
There's a question. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question right, but question on being able to use out-of-the-box components for Blazor WebAssembly. And then I asked for a follow-up on that. And they said, like with web forms, you had out-of-the-box grids. So I know for web forms, like one thing I recommend people look at Jeff Fritz's, he's got web forms components implemented in Blazor. So that isn't a good option. But I think if I'm reading this right, question on, is there a way to kind of just drop components easily into a Blazor WebAssembly project? Like, do we have recommendations for people on moving to components?
Safia?
I'm not sure that I totally understand.
I guess
question.
Same. I think maybe just redistribution of components. Like I know vendors have components that you can install and stuff. I mean, a component really, you've got like a Razor file and
yeah. So if your intention is, can I bring my own custom components into an existing Blazor WebAssembly project? Yeah, you definitely can. You can ship it out and package it as a NuGet package that you reference within your application. Yes is the answer.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, saw some other people on the chat just asking generally about the idea. There's a question going way back that I did my best to answer. And it was on, like, hey, if I want to convince my boss that we can use Blazor, what are some examples of, like enterprise, or who are some of our larger users? So I always tell people the .NET website itself uses Blazor, including for these live TV shows. And then I also pointed them at when we had the, this looks ugly, but it was the material design show. There were two applications there that I thought were really interesting. One was medical and one was real estate. And both of those are companies that are shipping projects built using Blazor. Are there any more that you know of that we can talk about, or examples at Microsoft or wherever?
Yeah, I know there's quite a few internal apps that are using Blazor. We also showcased some during our .NET Conf last year, I believe. It might have been in the keynote. So yeah, usually we try and get a few out during either these live streams or during the conference presentations that we do.
One thing I always like to tell people too is that, Blazor is built on web standards. It's, it's WebAssembly. It's just standard things. And especially if you're doing Blazor server, I mean, that's very simple, very standard stuff. So it's, especially Blazor server is not at all like
Yeah, and I think for something like that, and I think another thing to consider is not just what other enterprise applications are using Blazor, but also taking a look at like the ecosystem and technology that's available. So with Server, you can build on top of all of the tooling that exists in Visual Studio and .NET for working with .NET applications. You can also build on some of like the best practices that have existed in the web. So I think another good thing to consider as well is the ecosystem around it.
Great. All right. Let me see. A question on mono linker used in the components folder, and what's the status on mono usage in .NET Core, or excuse me, in Blazor?
So the linker is a SDK component. Blazor, it's a .NET SDK component. Blazor is a .NET project. It uses the same trimming. Like I think they now use the word trimming instead of linking, because linking has overloaded semantics. But like it uses the same trimmer as every other .NET project. So when you do a self-contained single file exe, it does trimming. It's the same trimmer that runs for Blazor WebAssembly too. That lives in the mono/linker repository on GitHub, but it ships as part of the .NET SDK.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we started a little bit late, but we are kind of running towards the end of our time. Do we want to finish by just reminding people of kind of like the next upcoming sprints and where they can go to learn more and get involved and stuff?
Yeah, aka.ms/Blazor-sprints is a good homepage to hit up. Every second Thursday of the month is when we do them. As always, you're welcome to at any point check out the help wanted issues in the repo.
Can you share that on your screen and show here? I'm bringing your screen back up.
Yep.
Just want to, especially because people join at different parts during this, I want to make sure everyone sees this, because those Blazor sprints I think are really cool. It's a amazing resource, and it's pretty neat to be working directly with the Blazor team on contributing. So.
Yeah, and there will be some exciting developments around this in the coming weeks. Teaser. But yes, this is kind of like the landing page. It talks a little bit about what it is, gives you some guidelines for how it'll work. We've also got a project conventions and source map section that Pranav created, which if you want to dive in a little bit more into what is in all of the directories that we have, this explains that. Steve Sanderson also put together a how to submit a PR and expectations section that talks a little bit about the process before, during, and after your PR is created or merged. So yeah, lots of interesting info here. And then we have a GitHub query that showcases all of the issues that are available to work on if you're curious to dive in.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very awesome. Thank you, Pranav, for coming in and talking a little bit about your own development workflow. I hope it was helpful for folks to see how we, as people who are working on this code base day in, day out, have our developer workflows. And I hope to see some PRs coming our way from the community.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks a bunch, everybody. And we have the Blazor community stand-up every month. So looking forward to doing this again in a month.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Bye, folks.
Thank you. Bye.